Marineford is arguably the greatest arc in One Piece, often said to be second only to Enies Lobby, and the sheer magnitude of what this storyline meant for the overarching narrative of One Piece is still unmatched to this day. And so when I decided to approach the topic of Marineford to break down everything that went into the finale of the first act of One Piece, I very quickly realized that there is simply too much to unpack in one video. Which is why today I'm actually going to be setting aside the grander themes and storylines that all came to a head in this ridiculously ambitious storyline, and instead start by focusing on something very simple. Maybe even just the first adjective people think of when describing the arc. Hype. What made Marineford so hype? And right now you might be rolling your eyes thinking, Morge, what are you doing talking about hype? That's not storytelling. What does hype really even mean anyway? Well, first of all, I'm not claiming that Marineford is objectively hype, or that it is objectively more hype than other fictional wars. However, the reality is that at least among the vast majority of One Piece fans, this is almost always the arc that readers will point to when talking about why One Piece is so quote-unquote hype. The reality is that this one arc catapulted One Piece from simply the most popular manga in the world to this otherworldly stratosphere of popularity that it enjoys today. The reality is that this one arc resulted in an unheard of, record-shattering 37 million volume sales in 2011. And unlike Kimetsu no Yaiba in 2020, these record-breaking sales were not just the spillover effect from an extremely high-quality anime taking off. Marineford's numbers were purely the result of page-turning, edge-of-your-seat manga storytelling across 30 masterfully executed chapters. As such, it almost seems necessary to break down the unprecedented hype behind Marineford. What was the craze behind this arc? Why was it so widely viewed as a must-read event? Because really the unprecedented level of week-to-week excitement Oda brought out through Marineford was not some accident. It was the result of many methodical storytelling decisions across hundreds of chapters leading up to it. And so with this video, I want to talk about the steps Oda took in building up the stakes leading to this explosive 30-chapter stretch. Because to say there's no point in talking about the hype behind Marineford is to discredit 500 chapters of careful setup and world building that went into setting the stage for the most anticipated war arc I have seen in any manga series. Now, I'm not going to argue that Marineford was the perfect war in terms of tactics or realism. Marineford was okay in this department, but it was certainly no chess match. Again, for this video, the specific area where Marineford succeeded as a war, better than any story I've read or watched, Japanese or Western, was in nailing the hype that an all-out war should deliver on. Because I think we've all seen from plenty of series at this point, again Japanese and Western, that many times writers will attempt to have this big finale war scenario where they just throw lots of characters together to fight with the assumption that this will automatically be hype, when often it ends up feeling lazy, messy, and even anticlimactic. But a huge part of what made Marineford actually exceed expectations was that it wasn't just the fact that it was a big war of the strongest that made it so exciting, it was the amount of build-up that went in beforehand into individually hyping up all of the major players. Because sure, if an author wants to do a big war sort of conflict, then it's not necessarily bad writing to introduce a lot of the stronger players close to when the battle starts. However, a huge reason Marineford stood out as such an exciting prospect as we led up to it was because in the 500 chapters preceding it, Oda had gotten the reader interested in almost all of the major players of the war, one by one, individually. Now, generally, a surefire formula to get a reader excited for a character to show up again is if the character is extremely strong, if they make a big impact on the reader from their introduction, and if their appearances in the series are extremely rare. You've got those three factors and you're pretty much guaranteed to have a character that readers really want more of. And by chapter 500, we had pretty much a giant laundry list of characters that fit this bill. I mean, Mihawk, Aokiji, Blackbeard, Doflamingo, Kizaru, Kuma, Ace, Garp, on, all these characters that we knew were extraordinarily, immeasurably strong that had made extremely memorable and extremely brief appearances in the story up till this point. Any single one of these characters making an appearance in a chapter was a major event on its own. And so much of this comes from the fact that Oda took his time getting you excited for each character one at a time and making you understand how significant each individual player was. I mean, just look at the Shichibukai. Out of the three great powers of the world, I think we can all agree that the 7 warlords are probably the least significant of the bunch. Even Oda admits that the story was always going to be about getting to the 4 emperors, and the warlords are mostly just characters that he invented that accidentally drew out the middle portion of the story a lot longer than planned. In fact, the warlords have been completely abolished at this point in the story, and it doesn't really matter to the bigger forces. But even with the Shichibukai, the lowest of the three groups, the first group introduced, Oda took a ridiculous amount of time stressing the weight that a single warlord carried in the world. I'm not even just talking about the Mihawk scene, that one's a given. Let's even move past that and just look at this first meeting in Marijoa. For any other writer, it would have been easy to say, okay, now is the time to show the 7 warlords to the reader. We're hundreds of chapters into the story, this is the world's most important summit, supposedly the balance of the entire world is at stake. Yet, how many actually showed up? 3. Literally just 3, one of whom we'd already met. And more importantly, the way Oda spun it wasn't that only 3 showed up. Instead, we were told the opposite, that the fact that even just 3 of the 7 bothered to show up was a huge deal. This is a very important difference in framing. It immediately reinforces the idea in the back of the reader's minds that the Shichibuka aren't just a standard shonen squad of strong guys. These are 7 completely separate entities that each individually carry a huge amount of pull in the world. They don't just show up to meetings. Even just a few of them in the same place is a major occurrence. Basically, even the summit of the world's superpowers didn't just dump a bunch of strong characters on us at once as an ensemble. We actually only got a quick glimpse of 2 more of the 7, and after this we had to wait another 200 chapters to get to the next Shichibukai, who himself had an entire arc devoted to him. And really, I wouldn't even call this summit the main introduction to Doflamingo or Kuma. If anything, it was just a teaser to get us a little hyped about these mysterious new individuals. Whereas Doflamingo's real introduction was arguably this scene in Jaya specifically devoted to him, showing us the biggest pirate in Jaya was nothing more than an ant before him, as well as giving us a deeper glimpse into the craziness that comes with Doflamingo. And same with Kuma. He hardly spoke at the summit, and instead he was saved for one of the most iconic scenes in the entire series, where he absolutely stole the show and became the most memorable part of Thriller Bark by far, as well as leaving us with a ton of question marks about his character. Point being that by the time Marineford was rolling around, Mihawk, Doflamingo, and Kuma were all individually extremely enticing prospects for any storyline, independent of any of the other Shichibukai, because each of them had individually made huge impressions on the reader, and left us wanting to see more. On top of them, we had Blackbeard, who was arguably becoming the most interesting character in the series by this point with his own major running storyline, Jinbei, who had been built up literally since East Blue, and this mysterious 7th Shichibukai who had yet to even be named. So when we finally got this idea pitched to us of all the Shichibukai versus the Whitebeard pirates, that concept alone was an amazing way to sell the war at the time. Just the idea of all these highly anticipated individuals actually coming together into one place and fighting together was insane to think about. Consider that for a moment. At that time, you could have literally just had the Shichibukai versus the Whitebeard pirates as an event, and that alone would have had a ridiculous amount of hype going into it on its own. But as we all know, Marineford was actually so much bigger than even that. If anything, this was a conflict of such ridiculous proportions that even such highly anticipated Shichibukai finally lined up all together in one place weren't even the main attraction. And I'm not going to waste time going over this with everyone who participated in Marineford. I think we all understand how surreal it was to see all 3 admirals casually sitting in a row together, after Aokiji and Kizaru by themselves had each independently changed the course of the entire series just from their initial introductions. But I hope you understand the point I'm getting at, which is that Oda rarely dropped ensembles on us. He wanted every single big name in the series to make a splash on their own first, which is why he took the time over 500 chapters to get the reader invested and excited in all of his heavy hitters, individually, one at a time. As such, by the time of Marineford, there were dozens of characters in the One Piece roster that could immediately make a chapter, quote-unquote, hype, just by making an appearance. If after Sabaody you told a reader that Luffy would be encountering Kizaru in Impel Down, that would be insane. If you told a reader that Blackbeard would be dropping in on Amazon Lily, that would be insane. So to set up a scenario where all these individually heavily anticipated big names are all made to somehow come together at the same time and place into one single, larger-than-life conflict, creates this feeling of absolute awe. That's what Marineford was, the ultimate payoff. Everyone that has individually been built up and teased for hundreds of chapters, all converging in the same storyline, like this giant wave where everything that we've wanted to see for so long is just happening all at once. Now, it wasn't just the work Oda did hyping individual characters. When we actually got to the point that the war itself was on the horizon, the build-up phase all the way up to the day of the battle was handled brilliantly. The 50 chapters from the announcement of the war till Whitebeard's arrival at the battlefield were a perfect showcase of how vivid and vast the One Piece world really is. We see characters across the globe reacting to the news, and as the war approaches we can feel the entire One Piece world beginning to shift in preparation for this great event. Chapter 524's title, Nothing Can Stop It Now, perfectly captures this sense, as we see countless characters from all corners of the One Piece universe assembling. Minor and major, weak and strong, even those we've only caught glimpses of before, they are all coming out of the woodwork for this one battle. The entire entity known as the Marines, that was more of an abstract, sprawling organization up till this point, is now all forming together in one spot. And most importantly, this is all happening in the backdrop of the main plot. Even after the war is announced, the focus is still entirely on Luffy's personal adventures. It's just that there is this ever-growing shadow in the background hanging over the plot, and as the war gets closer, the tension rises higher and higher. Counting down days to the execution, then hours, hearing that Whitebeard's made a sudden move, then Kaido's made a sudden move, then even Shanks, until finally we're at the day of the execution and we're getting snippets all across the world, seeing all 4 blues, with normal citizens reacting in a remarkably human and realistic manner in the advent of a great world war. The battle itself being broadcasted for everyone to see. The way Oda led up to this moment and set the stage for it all could not have been done any better. Because the concept of an all-out war of the strongest is grand on its own, but it wouldn't have felt half as powerful if Oda hadn't absolutely nailed the setup to make sure that the reader felt the monumental weight behind what we were about to witness. Even just the small things we see before the war begins are particularly well directed for One Piece. The long walk up to the platform, the rapidly zooming landscape shots, it was all remarkably cinematic. And kicking it off with Whitebeard literally cracking the air as though reality itself was shattering, only to follow it up with 2 gigantic waves rising over the battlefield, was basically the most cinematic start you could ask for as well. And let me take a moment to talk about the hype behind Whitebeard, because I really haven't mentioned him so far. So remember, at this point we had not seen much of the Emperors. We knew Shanks and Whitebeard were Emperors, we'd heard of Kaido and Big Mom, and we had this general concept that the Emperors are a big deal. But with Marineford, the true magnitude of what it meant to be an Emperor of the Sea was hammered into us. And it didn't start when Whitebeard threw out his first attack, it started from the first moment the war was announced. A lot of this goes to the scale of the world that Oda has built up, as one by one across this long journey, we've been meeting all these powerful world figures with vast influence across the seas or godlike abilities. And then when this one character decides he's going to fight, suddenly, nearly every single one of these larger-than-life figures we've met so far has to come together to stop him. The setup at Marineford was basically us seeing the entirety of the One Piece world as we knew it up till that point, all coming together as one allied force to stop one empire. The more fleshed out the world is, the more time Oda spent individually building up ideas like the Buster Call, the threat of an admiral, the power of the warlords, and so on, the more jaw-dropping it was to see all of these parties forced to marshal together just to stop a single emperor. And I'm not getting into actual power scaling here, there's a wide range of opinions. I know some people even believe that every single admiral was actually stronger than Whitebeard during the war, but those are technical disputes that came up after the war passed. I'm talking again purely about the excitement behind Whitebeard going into the war at the time. It really felt as though this one character was bending this entire gigantic fictional universe around him, as everything on the ocean was threatened by the force of him making his move. We see everything just grinds to a halt when just one of these emperors is going to war, and we can see the rest of the world stops and holds its breath to watch it play out. Characters like the Supernovas, who seemed like such a huge deal just 50 chapters ago, are now just insignificant onlookers in the face of the forces at play here. We can literally see the waves caused by Whitebeard going to war as it affects the entire planet. And finally, what really hammered in the scale of the conflict when the war began was Luffy's experience. It's been a long time now, so it's easy to forget, but for the vast majority of pre-timeskip, pretty much anywhere the Straw Hats went, it was Luffy who was the monster. Unlike a lot of other series, the story doesn't start with Luffy as an underdog who has to get stronger. In fact, the first 100 chapters is Luffy conquering all of East Blue without really breaking a sweat. He didn't even get serious till Arlong. Luffy would struggle more after he left East Blue, but still, pretty much every single island he went to, he would leave its citizens in awe of his strength. It didn't matter if it was a giant kingdom with elite warriors of its own, or an island filled with characters who regularly stomped famous pirates, or even other fast-rising pirates themselves. Luffy would usually end every arc as the strongest guy on the entire island. If there was someone stronger than him beforehand, he would beat them up by the end anyway. And of course that makes sense, as that is Luffy's role throughout the story. He's the one who brings the dawn, he travels from land to land encountering great evils that no one else can beat, and only Luffy is able to take them down. By necessity, he can't afford to be weak or be outshone when he comes to some new environment. He always has to be able to do what no one on the island thought possible and slay that unslayable dragon. And that was the pattern over and over again. Luffy was always the big fish, defeating evils that everyone else thought were unbeatable. It didn't matter that the Straw Hats were traveling all over the world. Luffy was still stronger than 99.99% of characters they would run into. In fact, during this pre-time skip period, it was actually extremely rare for Luffy to even be around characters that were stronger than him, as they would either quickly exit the story, or Luffy would get stronger and beat them up. For about 500 chapters, literally the only recurring character the Straw Hats would run into that Luffy couldn't beat was Smoker. That's it. And then we get to Marineford, and it was like falling off a cliff. All of a sudden, Luffy is completely and utterly out of his depth. Yes, in other stories, it's normal to see protagonists get into situations where they find themselves out of their depth. But with Marineford, to suddenly see this protagonist, the champion of nations, the savior who could always beat the big bad everyone else believed to be invincible, the strongest guy on pretty much any island he set foot on up till this point, to see this protagonist, so ridiculously, so drastically out of his depth, was a completely different reading experience. Yes, we'd gotten a taste of this as the Marineford saga started with uncharacteristic humblings for Luffy in Sabaody and Impel Down, but the Marineford War itself was those experiences multiplied 20-fold. Every 10 feet, Luffy would run into someone like a Kizaru or a Kuma. He couldn't turn his head without facing down a Shichibukai. New world characters that up until now had been extremely rare, life-threatening encounters for the protagonists that we would only get maybe once every 100 or so chapters for a little rush of excitement, were now pretty much all converging around Luffy at once. And to really put things into perspective, characters like Smoker, who Luffy could never beat, or the Pacifistas who took the entire Straw Hat crew to defeat, these types of enemies were now practically common foot soldiers in this gigantic conflict. The Vice Admirals, who seemed so intimidating during the Buster Call, with the threat of just 5 of them assembling together essentially being a doomsday scenario, even they were simply a footnote amongst everything going on. It wasn't just Luffy who was suddenly now a small fry. Countless characters stronger than him were small fry as well. It felt absolutely overwhelming in the best way possible. It was the fact that Luffy, who had been a giant everywhere he went, was now suddenly having his entire journey so far trivialized and being shown the blunt reality that in the grand scheme of things he is actually an ant among a sea of real giants that gave Marineford this dizzying sense of scale. So to sum up, the excitement behind Marineford was truly 500 chapters in the making. For the longest time we followed this main character who is stronger than pretty much 99% of the characters we meet, even compared to plenty of characters who are supposed to be extremely strong in their own right. Luffy is just a monster. He comes out as number 1 at the end of every arc. But along the way we keep getting a bunch of characters popping up, ever so briefly, who quickly establish themselves as stronger than Luffy, but not just stronger, a lot stronger. Like, we don't even know how big the gap is, but it doesn't matter too much because these type of guys come in and out so quickly and so infrequently, and they don't really mess with the main events of the arc. They just show up and establish that they exist, and then they're gone. We get really excited and hyped about these characters, but we know we won't get to see them probably for a long time. And then we get to Marineford, and suddenly all these guys are coming together in one place. Everyone we've been waiting on to see more of for so long are all just going to be fighting together. It's all just happening at once, right now, and the craziest thing is that they're all fighting together because of one guy. And so everyone we wanted to see for so long is all in this one place. We finally realize that all of this stuff beforehand was basically a lie, and Luffy's in fact stupidly, unimaginably far off from the top, that the scale of this world is way crazier than we realized before. And now we start to understand that if this one guy carries so much weight, then the fact that there are actually 4 of him out there means that we were just getting started. And the real story of One Piece is pretty much heading towards one of the grandest, most ambitious fictional conflicts of all time, if Oda sticks the landing. So all that is to say that Marineford, that is so universally praised as the hypest arc of One Piece, wasn't just hype on accident. It wasn't as simple as declaring a big war between strong characters. That's something you'll see in plenty of other series. Rather, Marineford hit so hard as a result of time being devoted to each individual major player in advance, masterfully executed rising tension and tightening atmosphere leading up to the war, and perhaps most importantly, the way the protagonist's journey was deceptively framed for the entire first half of the series, in order to finally pull back the curtain on the true level of the world in the most dramatic way possible. If you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, share, and subscribe. And you can join my Patreon to help me continue making videos like this in the future. Benefits include voting on future video topics and access to my Extended Thoughts podcast. With special thanks to patrons A. Abazi, Camp Raftel, Crimson Crystal, Felix Fourcolor, Felix Tanguay, God Complex, Lorenzo Linares, Mark Henderson, Neil Patel, Sebastian C, Simon Fines, Spike SP, Wisdom Manari, Keiichi 12, Hours Blank 13, Andy Thameli, Agam, Alfred Laufred, Amalite 2609, Batos Zawada, Behenort, Charlie Hustle, Chris Kresser, Cool Ice, Danieru, Dark Eternal, Dice, Frank Cervantes, Garrett Clark, Hector Lange Sanchez, I Think the Fire Festival is Going to Fail, Jacob Heller, Jarrett, Joaquim Torneas, John Renar Melting, Jonah Green, Jordan, Juan Perret, Kaname, Laura, Lun, Lena, Luis Aguirre, Marcia Yang, Mayoi Hachikuji, Melanie G, Minaj, Michelle Dreyer, Mr. Pike, Mo Musa, Mohammed Al Nayadi, Moses Williams, Mr. G, Naji, Paper Patriot, Patron, Pedro Escobar, Raizi, Rain, Rob Williams, Rohan Chug, Rohanite, Ryan Gerada, Savvy, Sebastian Calvo, Sharon Stevenson, Siddharth Vadnerker, Sir Praligod, Soshield, Shrikar Govindara Jula, Sriracha Limes, Stevie Wonder, Boy 13th, Telekinetic Guitar, The Royal Shichibukai, Vince T, Wiase, Zaos, Yihang Zheng, Bean, Guillaume Cremes, Inistor, Isopod Shuffle, Ravine, Sin7H37IC, Ace Goldie, Lolly, and Your Big Mom.